All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining Growing Up Fundie, the live stream. Today we have Eric from the Investigative Millennial channel. You can find his channel linked below in the comments or in the description, not in the comments, although I'll add it in the comments now that I said it was there. But before we do that, I learned how to do my theme song on a live stream. So we're just going to celebrate that for a second and we're going to do the theme song and then we're going to come right back. All right, cool. If I can get it to work for me. Oh no. Oh no. Wait. Oh. There we go. I've never felt more like a real YouTuber than that moment. Eric, thank you for sharing that moment with me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It will go down in my history books. So,
Yes, yes. It'll live in infamy. Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and for doing a live stream. I know that live streams can be a little intimidating to some guests. So the fact that you just jumped right in and you were like, yeah, let's do a live stream, I was wildly impressed. Stoked to have you on the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
yeah, absolutely. So, just the present day, I guess I'll say that I currently, I am a Christian who's basically done a lot of work on different topics, different subjects. I'm basically, I've, I guess the way I started my channel was just the reason where the title came from was because of kind of like in the more 2015 era and 2016 era, millennials kind of got like this horrible reputation of just being like, snowflakes and everything else. Um, but at the same time, I kind of was like, well, I like to investigate things and I don't want to be, I'm not going to scream or cry or anything else with that. And so I wanted to sort of subvert the trope, actually, I guess. I originally had a blog, but I've kind of just gone away from that at this point. And I just started to do more YouTube content. And yeah, that's kind of where I've been at for a while, and just I try to do things.
Patience is key, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, same. Let's see. Um, I'm gonna wait for him to come back. He came back before. There he goes. Oh, wait, there he is. You're
Okay,
back. There you go. Okay,
all
so
right.
sorry.
So
So,
did you hear anything, or did you just hear the whole thing, or did you?
so I lost you at you were talking about starting your YouTube channel, and then I lost you after that.
Okay, yeah. Well, basically, I wanted to do more stuff with regards to YouTube because my writing, I guess, writing doesn't really have much of a tone, and like people can easily sort of misinterpret it, or different things like that. So, and honestly, I just was more good at just speaking things rather than just
Yeah.
writing it and trying to put it into that and everything else. So, also, my specifically my mother complained about my grammar, so I'm just like, oh, well, if my mom doesn't even look again, I'm just like, well, all right, fine. I'm just going to do YouTube, and I don't care if I speak perfect English or not. I'll just analyze things, and I will, come to the best conclusion that I can, regardless of, whether it agrees with me or not, but prior to what I believed before. So,
So when you investigate, what are the main like modes and methods that you use for your investigation? Is it like the internet, the Bible, a little bit of everything? How do you know that what you're getting is actual like fact and what you need in order to feel comfortable with the answer?
yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of different things. It does depend on the specific nature of the topic. Like, for example, when you're talking about specifically, um, I don't know, just claims about like somebody's book that was written about like a historical subject, like the gospel specifically. Um, and you can look at it, and people typically I actually look at the bibliographies and everything, so I actually do go back, and which is kind of why I have a huge amount of books on my subject, because I literally buy the book just to basically see if what they said was actually true. And I can't do that with everything, because there are some things that are accessed only to certain people, and different things like that. But I tend to just want to I do a bit of a combination of reading a book, but also I do try to see, like, okay, I'll look on the internet. Is this just like a completely outlandish claim that the author is making? Is there any sort of basis to this at all? Is there like an internet is and you do have to do a bit of searching with Google, and you also may have to search depending on the subject, like specifically when you're talking about the Bible. You may have to do like academic journals, or sometimes I even, because of the credentials, because I went to a Gordon College, which is also a Christian school, but it was a lot more conservative when I was there, but than when it is now. But essentially, just looking at the academic, specifically like journals that are available to alumni of things like that, that can really be very beneficial, like to see if, okay, like you made this claim about the culture, is that like is does everybody agree with that? Does some people agree with it? But yeah, there is a lot of different methods that you can use. But typically, I would say that it varies between like books, internet, and a lot of, and sort of just overall, like I also just use a lot of reasoning and things like that to try and understand, how to understand things in the first place. So
Sure.
that's a brief overview. So
Yeah. And so when you say, for example, you're studying a topic, this has probably happened, maybe it hasn't, but you find just as much evidence to the antithesis as you do to the pro. How
mhm.
do you decide which one you're going to go with? Because I know, especially in academia, I know there's this push to always publish research, research,
Mm.
research. And so sometimes research takes you in different directions. How do you know which one, or how do you decide which one you're going to follow? Is it case by case?
It is really case by case, because like academia, I mean, if it was like, if you could formalize it, there wouldn't be like any need for any PhDs. Like you wouldn't be able to like study an entire lifetime and say, this is exactly how we do it. And so there is a case by case scenario. But like again, it does depend on the topic. Some topics I don't even know really as much how to investigate specifically, at
Yeah.
least not yet. But I'm just kind of like, oh, at least the topics that I know more about, and different things that I feel like I can at least say something that's more unique, rather than just like necessarily parroting other people.
Hey, now, don't come for my parrots. Don't do that.
Oh,
They don't do anything wrong. They did nothing to you.
no. Uh,
Um, that's interesting. And so, has there ever been a time when you were researching something related to the Bible where the answer actually ended up being the complete opposite of what you thought it was going to be or what you wanted it to be?
yeah, I mean, there was actually a topic like that, specifically with the doctrine of like eternal security, or perseverance of the saints, whatever you want to call it.
Oh, I think we lost him. He'll be back. He'll be back. He's not going to leave us hanging. Now, a word from our sponsor. We don't have one, but I'll come up with one. In the meantime, enjoy the smooth jazz. That wasn't jazz. I'm sorry. I don't know what that was. I apologize for doing that to everybody. Oh, he left. Okay, I think he might be coming back. Hold on. Um, until then, ladies and gentlemen in the chat, if you oh, there he is. Perfect.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Sorry
Okay,
about
so
that.
the
Yeah.
last thing I heard you say was that there was a topic like that
Mhm.
that was, but I didn't hear what it was or anything like that if you said that afterward.
Yeah, no.
Um, Maybe this can become an ASMR channel real quick. Oh, that was loud. I'm sorry. Oh God, I'm already failing.
Okay.
There he is. Perfect.
So
He's back.
it was actually the doc. Okay. Okay. Am I back?
Yes,
Am
you're
I?
back.
Okay. Okay. Good. All right. So basically, it was the doctrine of once saved, always saved. Actually, so because I was like my mom still believes it. I was taught it at almost every church that I went to growing up. Whether and it wasn't like because I never even knew what Calvinism was until I went to college. But it was actually typical free will believers who just believe that you can never lose your salvation. And it was kind of just the fact that I mean, not only was there like a huge amount of like Christians who also disagreed with that idea, but it was really like I mean, I did see admittedly where like why people believe the opposite, but it was just I think what really was kind of the tiebreaker in my opinion was just I actually was just doing like so much research, and this inevitably led me like, and this was when I was talking about like why I believe the Bible may be true. I constantly came across ex Christians, and in research and different things like that. So I was like, well, okay, maybe if it was
Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. You're gone, Eric. I don't know if you can hear me wherever you are, but you're gone.
and
We don't
claim,
have you here. Oh, there he is. Okay, he's back.
oh God,
There you
yeah,
are. Yeah, you're
I
back. Okay.
I actually could hear you there.
Oh,
So like,
perfect.
yes, no, but yeah, um, so anyway, like I was saying, it was really just a lot of countless different really just experiences to the point where I was like, okay, well, I can't really believe that like every single person who's ever claimed to not be a Christian, or sorry, who's claimed to once be a Christian and now isn't. It just seemed rather implausible that every single one of them was either just lying, or never really saved, or because that's another thing. So that's
So, to just to make sure I understand, do you believe that once people are saved, they are always saved, or you
no,
believe that you have
actually, I
to
don't.
maintain your salvation?
No,
Okay.
I believe actually basically you can lose it, but not because of like sinning or anything. You can only lose it if you basically just give it back, essentially. Like
Okay.
the only thing that really got you saved is, trusting in Jesus at that point. And so really the only thing that could revoke that would be, you know, doing the opposite. So
So basically, like rejecting God's name in a certain way is the equivalent of kind of like turning in your card.
basically, yeah, essentially that's what it was because
I'll play the theme song again because I don't know about you guys, but I loved it.
yeah, I
Perfect. Oh wait, he's back. We got him.
okay. Oh god, yeah. I'm just I don't know what made me think of this, but I just remember from SpongeBob, like the patchy thing saying, "I hate technology," and that
Yeah.
was just that was just me in a bit. But
Yeah.
anyway,
So, how do you research something like eternal salvation, something that can't be physically proven or disproven? How does one research something like that in like an unbiased way?
yeah, I mean, it is a sort of a religious truth, and I mean, really,
Thank you. Thank you, Crystal.
It is. Please.
Oh, there he is. Perfect. He's back. Okay. So I didn't hear your answer.
It's okay. It's okay. So basically, the idea is we do have to get to the root of like what the original authors maybe have intended to say, and that does require some amount of historical research, and of course the topic is really only relevant to humans. Obviously, if the Bible is true, you can still research, the most likely interpretation of somebody's words, but as to whether or not it's actually a true concept, that's another discussion entirely. But essentially, you do have to. One thing is
Well,
that,
sorry, quick thing.
mm,
Is that a different discussion entirely? Or is that
well,
the
it's not
same discussion?
entirely. Sorry,
Okay.
it's not entirely. It's just more. It's kind of like the fact that you do have to use certain tools because there isn't.
Brian, I think you're onto something. I think I'm going to have him call in. Hey, Eric, do you want to call in? If I
Actually,
put my phone number in the private chat, do you want to call and see?
yes. Actually, that would actually be probably better. So,
Okay, you can stay on camera if you want and maybe like mute your camera and then I'll put my phone number in the private chat because the internet's full of weirdos.
yeah, yeah, they definitely don't. Yeah, definitely keep it private. So,
Yeah, and then we can try that and
okay.
already.
Hey,
Let's
can you hear me?
Yeah, let's see. Audience, can you hear him?
Testing.
I can hear you. So let's try this out and see how that goes.
Okay, all right. This is actually way better. So, anyway, so like we were saying, you were talking about whether or not this is actually an entirely different discussion, and I was talking about history and everything. So, is that where we left off?
Yeah, so we were talking about how if there's an idea that's kind of like let's see, let me just see if I can get rid of this echo. We were talking about how if there is an idea that's basically like a religious, like spiritual idea that can't be proven through actual physical means, how do you prove that through research? Like, how do you research something that doesn't exist in a physical world?
Yeah, well, the thing is that there is a lot of different layers to the discussion because first we do have to identify the specific claims and the most likely thing that people meant by what they say. Like for example, when there are passages that say um, you were guaranteed when you believed or something or different things like that. So there is a lot of specifically like the first step is kind of just determine as much of the interpretation as you can, which does involve some amount of study and different things of studying specific aspects of just what the most likely, whether or not this was some kind of euphemism of the time, because typically there are a lot of things in the Bible that just like are kind of cultural that just roll off the tongue and kind of like just phrases that we use, but we do have to investigate that. But the first aspect is what really the claims are, and basically, you do also have to consider a lot of, has there been any specific things that have been, was this like something that was just made up yesterday? Has nobody ever discovered this beforehand? Because
it's kind of just like whether or not, did you, because the odds that everybody, like even the immediate disciples of Jesus's followers, just got everything wrong it's a little less believable. Now, the next step, of course, to see whether or not it's an actual concept, of course, that is actually relevant to the world. You would have to go into sort of a historical methodology that is just, and that's a lot more detailed in the research specifically, and that's, those are kind of the bigger, broader steps to even see whether something like that can even be, whether there even is an answer. So that's the kind of approach that I would basically take. Very briefly summarizing that. So.
Yeah. And so say, for example, you mentioned the disciples, and it sounded like you're talking a little bit more, and correct me if I quote you wrong. It sounds like you were talking almost like statistically. You were saying, the likelihood that they all got it wrong is just is low in your opinion, that many people would tell the same story the incorrect way, or they would get the story wrong. How do you know when old writing isn't old fiction? So, for example, we have fan fiction now. We have a fiction based on historical characters that actually lived. We have all sorts of writing now. So, what is it about the Bible itself that gives you the comfort that you need, especially when you're doing your research, and about biblical research, that makes you think this is a valid source, or this is a valuable source?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's a very multi-step process, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's really long and it's highly detailed, but I guess the first step, first of all, is to just look at, okay, because there is actually another thing that a lot of people kind of, and this is just sort of some disclaimer that I kind of like to put out there, because a lot of people, for better or for worse, kind of just look at the Bible and it's kind of like, well, if it has one error in it, then I'm just throwing everything out entirely.
Sure.
And,
yeah.
Well, and the thing is that that's not really necessarily a good method to do. And,
right.
And, just because there are other people who go in the opposite direction who say, hey, this place was verified and therefore, we can just trust the whole story. So
right.
That doesn't really work that way.
Right. It goes both ways. Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, it can do that, but the other thing is that, and a lot of things are very conscious, is that there are different ideas, or rather, sorry, not ideas, but there are, depending on the specific time period, because there are different standards of historical documents that we do expect. Like for example, if you talked about, when we're talking about written evidence, that like a volcano erupted today, and no news outlets covered it, nothing covered that at all. Well, you kind of be like, you're just lying, you're just making things up. But in the ancient world, I mean, the thing is that not only do you have so many, I mean, first of all, I mean, the population with the Roman Empire as a whole were just so, it was a lot, people were a lot less literate. So not only were there not nearly as many people who could read or who could actually produce a document, even if they wanted to, like, for example, Mount Vesuvius, the example that actually is there, and we really only have one serious contemporary document of somebody who actually saw it, which is actually Pliny the Younger, and he talked to, and he actually wrote about it with his death, the fellow historian Pliny the Elder. So it was, and I mean, that's unheard of. It would be completely ridiculous to believe that today in this context, but in an ancient context, you do have to determine, okay, should we actually expect this level of evidence, or what kind of things? And ancient history is a little bit more difficult, because the truth is that there are some people who've estimated that if you took all the ancient writings that we even have, just period, including the Bible, it'd probably only be enough to fill like 2 or 3 bookshelves. So in a library, and which is far less obviously than today. So we do have to, first of all, be conscious of that. The other aspect is that the Bible is, the biblical culture specifically, is more of an oral culture as well, but it also has a lot of, like we do also, and the other thing is that I'll get to that later actually, but the oral culture is basically, people did have to exercise a lot of their memories a lot more to basically go through everyday life. Those, because, you couldn't afford education to do that, or to learn how to read and write. And honestly, really, you didn't need to most of the time. Most people didn't really need to read and write because they were typically, in agrarian professions and different things like that. But the other thing is that when we're talking about like analyzing a specific claim or like a testimony of like a specific event, when we're talking about, for example, we'll just use the idea behind Jesus's crucifixion. Now, the thing is that there are not only there's plenty of other sources that do confirm it outside of the Bible, even. They don't confirm everything outside of it, but that one fact is actually fairly consistent. And the fact that in the culture, like, to say that your God or anybody was crucified is immediately just like a big, it's something that really is just so intrinsically unattractive about the idea that it's unlikely that, people would just make that specific aspect up. Now, and then we can also, the other thing is that, like, even if you don't consider, the Gospels, for example, to just be generally reliable, you can still typically trust that fact about, like, Jesus being crucified. I mean, even people like Bart Ehrman and, different people, basically almost anybody who isn't one of the, like a Jesus myther, does at least agree on that specific fact about Jesus. So that's really the bigger, broader picture. Now, there are other events, of course, that are definitely more controversial and definitely a lot more difficult to investigate at the same time. So there are different ideas about, like, just example. I'll actually do another event, which is actually the town of Bethlehem, the slaughter of the infants in the Gospel of Matthew. And, a lot of people do criticize that sort of event as, well, why doesn't anybody else mention this? And the thing is that, while that's not entirely a bad question, and it's definitely a thought worth having, the fact is that pretty much almost there weren't really parallels to newspapers back then in that sense, especially because documents, it kind of goes back to sort of the arguments from Silence and Vesuvius example. I mean, Herod did a lot of really kind of, like, he was very paranoid. In fact, there's actually a saying that it's better to be Herod's pig than his son, because he would almost want to kill, but because he suspects treason or that somebody's going to usurp his throne. So while that specific event, I mean, it to be completely objective, I mean, the historical, like, I believe that as, a Christian it happened, but that like, I wouldn't absolutely be utterly devastated if that, I couldn't verify that specific fact about the Gospels. And I mean, the town of Bethlehem, you also have to consider that it's a very small town, and he also only killed, like, the babies under 2, which, I mean, it's really difficult. I mean, in fact, it's impossible to know how many kids there were at the specific time, to really dissect whether or not it's actually plausible, it's implausible that nobody else would ever have mentioned this.
Mm.
And that's sort of and there are, of course, a lot of other events like the miracles. But I mean, before we get into that, there's another there's kind of another thing that will just sort of help a lot more with discussing the subject, which is kind of the dating of the Gospels, like, because that is also because typically there are really two schools of thought on this aspect. Like, more people in the realm of like Bargerman and different other critical scholars will typically try and push like Mark and Matthew and Luke into like 70 AD, 80 AD, and John typically they'll do it in the 90s AD at that point. So it is a big period of time in that one. Now, the other thing that we should be, and there are others who try to say that it's more, for example, the Gospel of Mark is, maybe you can say written closer to 45 AD, but either way, there is a common thread here, which of course is that obviously the Gospels were written far later than, typically modern people would expect them to be. And, we would really have to dig into, well, wait a second, like how does this really, is this plausible that they would have done this? And what we have to, and the thing is, in terms of the specific question, it's kind of just a very cumulative process. It's not like I can just give like one silver bullet thing that's just going to completely, overwhelm the other side. Because obviously, if it were that easy, you wouldn't need a PhD, or there wouldn't even be PhDs available for the topics. So,
right. So with,
I guess what I would.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, I did not mean to cut you off. I'm so sorry.
No, I guess I'll let you maybe ask the question first. I know I'm giving a lot of information, but I'll just say one thing, which is like, even if like, because the thing is that people, first of all, you have to consider that in the ancient world there were a lot more people, because people did in the Jewish culture specifically. It wouldn't be just something that, it's not some obscure thing that people just sat around for like 30 years, 15 years, and were like, oh, that happened. I remember, I think it happened that way, but and we know because, there were letters written to many churches. Now, again, the letters, the mere fact that they're letters, I will be fair to hear, it doesn't prove inherently that the specific content is true.
Right.
But obviously, if you're going to choose to send a letter to somebody, I mean, they have to exist, and they're going to be, because otherwise it's just a waste of money and time, especially with the cost of writing materials that's associated with that in that ancient world. So the fact that it would spread out, like simply by the simple logistics of travel back then, and, even because, they're not just going to up and go, tomorrow and just say, hey, I'm going to go to completely the Roman Empire today. And it's like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen, especially not, I mean, it's not even going to happen in the best, in the best of times today, much less back then, especially when, obviously, people had to work to survive and everything else. But so there is a lot of, the thing is that as they were preaching, and because obviously you have to convince people if you're going to make a church, at least to some degree, so you're going to be like preaching the teachings all the same time. And it typically, if you've just been living something for a long time, or even if you take a break from it for a while, it's very easy simply because of memory to get yourself back into the groove in a lot of cases. So there definitely is. So we do also, but then, I mean, I'll talk about the reasons what dates I assign, but I don't know. I don't want to overwhelm you too much. So if there's any questions,
So I guess my questions are mostly about the things that are a lot of the basis of Christianity is built upon that can't be historically proven. So, for example, salvation in general, there's not necessarily a historical way to prove salvation outside of what humans who, according to the Bible, even are inherently flawed, wrote themselves. And then these more abstract ideas like sin and different things that we can't look at a building and carbon date it, or we can't like dig up a fossil and say people went to heaven versus people went to hell. How do you let me ask you this. Do you believe in creationism? Are you a young earth creationist, old earth creationist? I guess we can start there.
Yeah, no. To answer your question, I sort of default to like a theistic evolution perspective. I haven't done the most research on it, to be honest, but I don't want to just completely disagree with the scientific community unless I have a really, really good reason. I'm really, really sure.
Yeah.
So to go back to what you were saying before about like specifically salvation and those concepts, you are right that historically speaking, that isn't something that you can verify. However, this is where like there's a bit of interdisciplinary like overlap in a way, because basically, if like for example, we'll talk about the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, if that happened, and he did what he said he did, and he actually went to the afterlife and everything else, then we do have a bit of a witness, or at least something like that. And of course, if he is a miracle worker and other things, and able to, he's really in control of various aspects, then it's not so much that the history proves the salvation, it's more the fact that somebody who would probably be in a really good position to know whether or not, like, what is even the nature of the afterlife. Like, is there an afterlife period? Is there even, and different things like that. So with regards to salvation, it is definitely not a physically provable claim. You can't wave like a salvation detector over somebody or anything. So it's more so rooted in a person, and sort of just a lot of what people wrote about what this person's teachings were. And, obviously that's contingent upon, the story being true and many other things. But essentially, that's kind of the angle that you would have to approach a topic like that. Because really, I mean, outside of, sort of religious figures, there's like, I don't know, people who die, they're basically, we can't ask them, what happened. So it is a lot more about, like, history can point you in some direction, even if, like, the actual epistemology of history, source criticism, it can't really, verify that. And, it can't verify certainly not every single aspect of that kind of a concept.
And so what is it about Christianity and having proof and evidence, and atheism and atheists having proof and evidence, that make you believe Christianity's evidence over atheist evidence? Because you mentioned that you don't like to argue against science, which I think is great. I love science. But a lot of times science either negates or at least somewhat combats a lot of what we're told in the Bible. And so when you come to moments like that where you have to choose between believing the Bible and believing science, how do you come to that decision? How do you know which one to go with?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. And the thing of it is that stuff like the miraculous, the way I look at it is, science, yes, it proves things about the natural world. For example, and yes, if you shoot somebody in the head, they're going to die, or things like that, or just extreme examples of that nature. And there are a lot of, specific scientific theories that are in a lot of ways undercut by well, I shouldn't say, because it's not so much that I think that science, like, for example, proves that somebody, like, it does prove that somebody can't rise from the dead naturally within anything like that, with any law of nature. Certainly not that we know of anyway, but the miracle of the thing is that it's not really the specific claim. It's not saying that, naturally this happened, or, it's saying, yes, there are natural physical laws. That's totally fine. I can totally believe that. But, miracles can do something that, the laws of nature can't necessarily do. So I don't see that specifically as an epistemology different, as a conflict. I mean, it is different fields of study, undeniably, even if there is a bit of overlap between them. But the thing is that even in that case where there is, where there are, like, miracles that, claim that do something that, can't possibly, that contradicts outright the laws of nature, then we do, of course, have to conclude, we have to say, okay, well, first off, is the story true? And it doesn't really disprove the law. It just says that there's something that's above it, if that makes sense.
So, like, I'm trying to think of some examples. So, like, parting the Red Sea, the burning bush, that would be categorized under miracles, knowing that they contradict the natural world and what you know to happen in, like, regular nature.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the case. The thing is that, like, yeah, because obviously it was contingent upon Moses. So, like, he did it when Moses struck the staff, but in a lot of ways. So, I mean, and staffs, aren't going to have an effect on an ocean, on, like, a huge sea. And it's the same thing with the burning bush. Those are good examples. Yeah, they that are, again, they're not incompatible fields. They can coexist with each other. It's just that they're different fields of study. So.
And one of our audience members asked a question that I thought was a really good question. He asked, which of your biblical conclusions conflict the most with how modern Christians think about the Bible?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I actually do have the YouTube stream, so I see Brian. Brian's the one who did that. But yeah, no, it's actually kind of well, I'll say that probably the biggest way in which it contradicts the modern way that Christians typically read the Bible. It's more so not like a singular verse. It's more just sort of an epistemology of, like, specific principles of hermeneutics and everything else. Because, like, I'll give you an example of something. If I, like, I'll just, and keep in mind in this, I'm just assuming in this case of a certain interpretation of the Bible that, is against, gay people, for example. Now, the thing of it is that ordinarily, assuming, of course, that, if 1 Corinthians 6 means what it says and it says what it means, then okay, that is what the Bible says. However, if, for example, somebody is, like, completely and utterly distressed, in a lot of ways, like, for example, like, if they say, like, let's say, like, a really dramatic example, let's say they're literally about to just kill themselves in that case. Well, there is other principles in the Bible that actually, because so many Christians will treat a Bible verse, they'll pick a Bible verse out for the week, and they will essentially just look at every single situation through that lens. And, while I've never heard of a specific Christian, quite going that far with, like, imminent danger, there is a bit of for lack of a better term, a prioritizing of principles that is honestly just completely absent from many evangelicals. Oh, sorry, Rebekah said I can't. I'm not hearing the sound. Is that? Can you still hear me, Sydney?
I can still hear you. Yep.
Oh, okay, yeah. But anyway, so the way that I view the Bible, and this does manifest itself in different ways in my life, like just for the extreme example, like, would you actually tell them something like, for example, like they just say, they're just so distressed. Would you just say, for example, you're perfect the way you are, in at least in that moment, which biblically speaking may not be true, but we have to really look at the situational awareness of that.
So are you saying, so sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm following. So are you saying that is, that proves that the Bible feels negatively about homosexuality, or positively,
no,
okay.
No, not at all.
Okay.
I'm trying to say there is, I'll put it as simply this way, there is a priority of principles, and one of them, for example, is life, like preservation of life and looking out for somebody's life in that way. And, if there's a conflict between the two, just for example, like, the stuff about, gay people versus the principle of preserving somebody's life, and that's a commandment. The thing is that so many people will just interpret one, it basically just absolutize one thing and just against all reason and just wooden reason, just constantly just say, well, no, we can't affirm them, but you'll just, everything else.
So when you say preserving someone's life, what do you mean by that?
Well, for example, if somebody is just like imminently in danger, at least for the time being, you would basically try to preserve that, at least in the moment. And obviously, psychological help would be necessary after that. But the point is that there is a certain recognition of principles that are, a lot more focused on specifically what is the greatest commandments and the greatest priority to people. In fact, I'll actually give an example that I do know about of how this was, at least in my opinion, very badly handled. There was a little while ago, there was this thing about John MacArthur, for example, and he had a church member who in the early 2000s, I think it was, named Eileen Gray, and she was being abused by her husband, and it was later found out that he was that he even abused their children and everything else. But when he wanted to come back and reconcile with her, essentially, she just said, no, I'm not going to risk that. And John MacArthur in the early 2000s, basically exercised church discipline, saying, well, you're divorcing for unlawful reasons. And, you can't do that except if he commits adultery, for example. And the thing of it is, and what he did was, and he basically saw everything through the lens, essentially, of do not get divorced, period, unless these specific conditions are met. Whereas the thing is that the other commandment of, first of all, Jesus even says in Matthew, if you're persecuted, which, I know persecution is a little bit different, but the same principle could be said, that you should actually run, and that there is a preservation of somebody's life in that way. And, of course, she felt as though her life was in danger. And so it's kind of more of just a priority of, because John MacArthur, and, this is kind of true of a lot of different preachers, unfortunately, they kind of view things like doing good as something to be sprinkled on top and around the commandments, whereas just being a commandment itself. And, I would have said, well, yes, ordinarily the laws, the rules, for example, against divorce would apply, but in this case, we do have to realize that the commandment of preserving somebody's life and loving your neighbor as yourself does take a lot of priority over that specific idea of, how you read the Bible, because this kind of, and there's a lot of, there are a few other examples, but essentially that's very broadly, and, we can get into some of the applications of that, but that's basically the idea of, basically as briefly as possible, to just say that's kind of a different way that I view the Bible as opposed to many other people.
So you are saying that some things take priority when they involve preserving someone's life over following the rules to a T, like a fundamentalist, basically.
Essentially, yes, but I would, and again, there are definitely other examples, like, it's kind of like, Jesus and the Sabbath, like, yeah, it was a commandment, but, it was more important to, relieve suffering even. And even when, actually, he even took it farther, like, he the guy, for example, with the withered hand, I mean, he wasn't going to die, and he could have technically waited, but he was like, no, forget it. I'm just going to heal you now. And thus it's so, yeah, I mean, that's basically, to sum it up, would be what I'd say.
Okay. And so what you're saying in response to Brian's question is, a lot of people say, no, you have to do things exactly the way that the Bible is saying. And you're saying there's nuance there, and there's the opportunity to make kind of informed decisions.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good way to sum it up, I think. But, and yeah, there are, because the thing is that there are a lot of different, because typically in the ancient world, rules, unless specified otherwise, tended to at least, they did tend to involve at least some level of pragmatism and nuance, but at the same time, it's not so much, sadly, in specifically, like, modern evangelicalism.
Yeah. And so would you say, I only bring this up because it came up earlier, would you say that say somebody who's homosexual or something like that, would you say that they are in need of preservation of life, like intervening on somebody who is coming to church but they're homosexual? Is that considered preservation of life in your personal opinion? Is that like an example?
So just hold on. So are you asking, like, specifically about, like, they're coming to a church and, they're just gay, and this church is just saying something that is not affirming that, or are you saying that they're intrinsically needing of preserving life?
Well, so earlier we had mentioned that a lot of people don't think that homosexuality is supported in Christianity, and and then you start talking about preservation of life, and so I was just wondering if, by trying to talk to somebody about their homosexuality, is that intervening to preserve their life? Like, do you think that there's something in their life that needs preserving that is not there currently, or is that
No, I was
okay?
just I was more just talking about, like, an immediate situation of,
Got it.
like, a person's literally about to just, for lack of a better term, pull the trigger.
Right.
In that sense, then that was kind of the situation that I was trying to compare it to. I'm
Got
not saying that, gay people are just going to die.
No. I didn't think you were saying that.
Yeah, gay or anything like that. No, that wasn't what I was saying. Don't worry.
Yeah, no, I didn't think you were saying that. I was just wondering if, like, being gay is a situation in which you thought they might need preservation of life from,
No,
or
I
okay.
was just saying that because there are many people who are just, like, so, psychologically abused to the point of, like, despair, and in that case, then it's not really the best thing in that case to like, intervene and just constantly beat them over the head with it. So
Yeah.
and you have to do. So I hope that clears it up.
Yeah, definitely. And are there any opinions that you have in terms of, say, what happens to us after we die, or heaven and hell, or what's considered a sin, what's not, that you are like 100% set in? You're like, I have seen what I need to see in order to know this thing or these things related to the Bible or Christianity or salvation, in your personal opinion?
Yeah, I mean, if I really had to pick one among like just that has really become completely that I've been more and more convinced of the longer I've studied in doing different things, it is sort of the doctrine of grace. You're saved only by grace, specifically alone, and that extends even to like even the preservation of salvation, specifically of like it's not as though you have to specifically do something to stay saved, or that you're kept saved by keeping certain commandments, or that if you don't keep certain commandments you're going to lose it. It really is just and there is some other nuance in there, and there's many other questions, but I've been more and more convinced of just the simplicity, because and there are even some people who will take this to a very they'll try to harmonize and try to sort of do things where they'll say, well, yes, you're saved by grace alone through faith alone, but at the same time, if you really, really were a Christian, you'd do X, Y, and Z, and different things like that. And essentially, and to an extent, I mean, I do believe that, it should, of course, have an impact on your behavior, but to the extent that so many other people will take it like, you have to, like, basically, agree with the entirety of, every single position that I believe in, every single thing that everything else, and that kind of a thing. And in fact, just to really go over all the nuance of it and different things like that would take actually quite a while. And but I actually did like a 2-hour interview, and thank you, Rebekah. Actually, I saw that comment about saying Eric has a really good understanding of salvation by grace. So yeah, we actually did like a 2-hour interview.
Yeah.
Of that on her channel. So that's actually it would take too long to really justify my position on that and all of the chaotic nuance. But needless to say, I routinely clash with many people who will try and immediately just sort of cast somebody, basically cast somebody out of the kingdom for believing something at least different. So.
And so do you think, and like in your honest opinion, do you think that somebody who lives a good life, like they don't ever commit a crime, they just, live a totally normal life, and they have always been friendly, they maybe donate to charity, but they never accept God as their savior, or they never get saved as to what we know saved to be, in like especially American Christianity, does that person still go to hell in your opinion?
Yeah, the thing is that honestly, this is kind of a topic that I kind of just am sad about.
Yeah.
In all honesty, like I'm kind of just like I kind of wish it wasn't there and that sort of thing. And some of my views have evolved on the nature of hell specifically. But needless to say, that's a whole other topic that I prefer not to get into now. But
Okay.
but needless to say, actually, just if you want to ask, I hold to sort of the same view that Rebekah does on that. But yeah, I do believe in the sort of, well, specifically, like I believe in more of the conditional immortality state and that sort of thing. So and that sort of thing. So essentially, yeah, I would say that unfortunately they wouldn't inherit eternal life in that way. But but again, it's sad, and that's kind of just what I conclude. I mean, he says that's what happens, and I by no means have to like it, but
Right.
I'm kind of just like, yeah, I kind of conclude that, yeah, that's kind of what's going to happen. So.
Has there ever been a point or a question from, say, an atheist that you've been like, That's a really good question. I still don't know the answer to that. Like, I still don't know how to approach that. Or do you feel pretty comfortable answering the majority of what they've said to you?
Yeah, that is a good question. And honestly, I would say probably in the realm of like the Old Testament, specifically text a lot of the time. I have some answers to some of those questions, but I mean, just kind of, I mean, the Levitical Code and different things like that. There are a lot of passages that I don't have an answer that doesn't even really satisfy me specifically. It doesn't like impact my ability to be a Christian because again, like I still am willing to trust in God at this point. But at the same time, even if I'm not gonna lie, I don't understand this like at all, and I'm kind of like I kind of wish that wasn't there. So
Yeah. Is there ever a question that you've wanted to ask an atheist that you haven't, or you felt like you didn't get a good enough answer to?
Not really. Not with regards to specifically atheism. I guess it's kind of not with regards to broadly, like, I wanted an atheist answer. There are certain atheists who, with regards to certain things they said, that I want answers to.
Oh, sure.
But,
Yeah.
but specifically, not with regards to atheism broadly.
Okay. And then do you think that, or let me ask you this, what is the biggest way that your Christian beliefs have changed since you've become the investigative millennial? What's the biggest thing where you were like, wow, I don't believe the way I used to anymore. I believe something different now.
Yeah, that's a really, because the thing is that my process has been, like, I've even learned things in the meantime while I've been, sort of on my YouTube channel and, but I would say, and it's a really big thing, but I would say probably the way that my faith has changed is kind of the way that we originally, I think in answer to Brian's question was like, how do you interpret the Bible? How do you view it? And it's kind of like, I guess that sort of operational sort of interpretation would be kind of how I view it. I think that's probably the biggest change. Whereas I might have, actually been a little bit more in line with standard evangelicalism, but more so when I was in college and everything. But at the same time, that's kind of what I would say.
Okay, so you used to be a lot more like conservative Christian, and now you feel a little less conservative, less evangelical.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the evangelical label is so it's so loaded now with not only like it's practically intertwined with politics and so many other things that, but I mean, in the respect that we're specifically talking about, I would say that yes, I do feel a lot less evangelical. I still really don't like a label for myself. I don't think of any specific denomination that really aligns with me, and I'm kind of just like, I'm, I don't know, it's kind of like the political spectrum. Like, what are you? It's like I'm an independent. I mean, I guess you could say I'm just a Christian independent at this point or something, if there's like a parallel to that. I don't know. So.
Do you think, and this is as political as I'll get, because I know we agreed earlier we weren't going to delve into politics. Do you think that the evangelical label for a lot of conservative, say Republicans, for example, is fair because those politicians do what they do specifically in the name of God? Like, do you think that that's actually a fair label because they're the ones evoking the name of God, as opposed to, say, for example, atheists being like, no, you evangelicals, like using it as like a bad word or something. If somebody says like, I'm going to, when I become a leader, whether it's president, whether it's the leader of a state or a member of Congress, when they say like, I'm going to lead the way that God intended, like according to the Bible, I'm an evangelical Christian, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that that is a fair label, or do you think they are misrepresenting the word evangelical?
Yeah, that is a good question because again, like I think that it's kind of like this, because there are evangelicals who, frankly, like as individuals, have rather unusual beliefs that may not be necessarily outside the norm. So, I mean, if they identify, I guess, just to go to the probably the most widely accepted definition of evangelical that would be accepted by most people who identify that way. If they identify as somebody who believes, that the Bible's the word of God, that you're saved by, grace alone, that you're, and sort of like more of the conservative ethics, I guess you can't say they're not an evangelical, but at the same time, I guess to say that like evangelicals as a whole believe this, I think may not be quite as fair, but it is a little bit tough, because yes, they do identify as an evangelical, and they fit at least as I understand it, sort of the basic definitions. Now, we could argue, whether or not, based on the Bible, they should do X, Y, and Z. But I mean, it's fair to call them an evangelical and say that things like that. But I wouldn't say. I guess I wouldn't. I'd only have an issue with that if they just said that evangelicalism, by definition, has to believe this specific way, or things like that. Really, I wouldn't necessarily be. But again, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to, somebody saying, hey, this is a belief that I don't think is right, and even if it is religious, I don't want it law or something.
So like, just like anything else, there are people that claim a label like that everybody else who has that label is like, I don't know if we identify with that. Like, so people say they're conservative, and other conservatives are like, you don't represent all of us. Or people say they're liberal, and we're like, you don't represent all of us just because you say you're one. And I feel like evangelical is similar to that in your mind, where there's like a spectrum. There's some evangelicals that believe that, but not all evangelicals believe the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. I think definitely it's certainly true that would be pretty much what I would say. Pretty much. I mean, there's always a spectrum of everybody there. So
yeah. And do you believe that people who, say, for example, live a bad life, maybe they commit a lot of crimes, things like that, but then they get saved and they genuinely mean it towards the end of their life, do you think those people go to the same heaven or have the same rewards in heaven as, say, somebody who dies as like an innocent teenager? Do they go to the same heaven, or do you think there's like different places for different people who acted in different ways, even though they were both saved in the nick of time?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a difference of rewards. I mean, it is technically the same place, but there is basically a sort of a reward and different sorry, I just laughed at Tim's comment that said we both know.
I thought of that the minute it was coming out of my mouth. I was like, there's no innocent teenagers.
Yeah, that's funny. But anyway, but getting back to the idea of, I mean, they technically do go to the same heaven, but they are. I mean, like Jesus said, if you even teach somebody to do, relax one of the least commandments, you're like the least in the kingdom of heaven. And so I think that obviously, like an axe murderer who, just repents on their deathbed, I mean, yes, they would be saved, but it's kind of like, but there's not really much to show for it. Like,
their credit score wouldn't be as good in heaven.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Yeah, for lack of a better term, credit. But yeah, there is, and we're not really specific as to what specific rewards people get necessarily, and it's just some kind of reward in different things. I mean, beyond a couple passages, there really isn't a lot of specific things about heaven and everything else. But and I will also say that in the event that like a person does genuinely mean it and repent, they're not going to have their same like old nature that they did. In that case, So they will essentially just, not have, the tendency to do those things because, obviously living them with them wouldn't be heaven. So.
And I see what you're saying. So like somebody who's like a serial killer on Earth isn't going to have serial killer tendencies in heaven.
Yeah, certainly.
Got it.
So,
Got it. And do you think that there is, and this is just in your personal opinion, if you're interested in answering this, do you think that there is a difference in the type of heaven that different denominations are going to go to? For example, would Baptist, do you think, be more likely to go to like a perfect heaven than Presbyterians or Mormons or something like that? Do you think denomination matters, or do you think all that matters is whether or not they are saved?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's definitely not like different specific heavens. I will say that, like, in the book of Revelation, it does say that there was like mourning in heaven temporarily, but at the end it says there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. And then it says there's going to be no more suffering, no more pain or death. But at the same time, no, I don't really believe that like there's going to be like the Presbyterian section and the Baptist section in heaven. We pretty much all go. I mean, we're going to go broadly to the same heaven. But yeah, I mean, basically, the thing that again saves you is like believing the specific gospel, at least that minimally. That's basically the minimum thing that that is there. So.
And what do you think happens to, you touched on this a little bit in your video that I watched about the salvation of infants, and whether or not infants go to heaven, which I thought was a very interesting video. What do you think happens to people, in your opinion, or perhaps you've researched this? What do you think happens to people who, say, live in foreign countries, who have never once been visited by a missionary? They've never heard of God. They've never heard of Jesus. They haven't had the chance to reject him, but they also haven't had the chance to accept him either. So we don't really know what they would do if given the chance. What do you think happens to them? Do you think there is like a purgatory, or do you think they still go to heaven?
Yeah, that's a really kind of another kind of a sad answer. But I mean, again, if I'm wrong on this, I'll be happy to be wrong. But what I think and is very present is like God certainly will not, for lack of a better term, on their sin counter for lack. It's not as though they're going to be as in like he's not going to like be mad at them for not accepting the gospel. I do think that in those extreme situations, you do really have to, because there is a bit of a difficulty because at the same time, and I'm not entirely, there are a lot of people who will try and make some exceptions with regards to that. But again, I'm not entirely certain, but I would say I don't want to take any chances, to be frank. I mean, it's kind of like, I do believe that, the gospel is necessary to be saved, but, it's kind of like, it's kind of like, the hell question. I kind of wish it wasn't that. And,
Yeah.
If I turn out to be wrong, I'm not going to complain one bit.
Yeah. Interesting. And so when it comes to something like salvation, and when it comes to something like who goes to heaven and who doesn't, what was the evidence that you saw or the research that you did where you were like, dang it, this is true, even though it's terrible, even though you wish it weren't true? What was it that you saw that that was enough for you to believe that that is how it goes?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a two-part thing because, like, I guess the one aspect of that is, well, actually, I'll touch more on this one subject of grace through faith, like sort of the grace through faith alone aspect of it, because, at least briefly, because, that's kind of the aspect of, and, there are obviously people who don't quite get that, agree with everything that I would say on that subject. I would say that, in all honesty, what really kind of pushed me over the edge was kind of just how so many people were just seemingly so like confident and because I admit that I was frankly a little bit intimidated at first by having, people who've been, studying the Bible way longer than I have. And who am I to, disagree with that and things like that. But eventually it just started to, like, the sort of overconfidence, in my opinion, that people had in their specific idea and articulating it. It really, it was just like so many people would be so confident, and they would say, well, if you don't say, if you do X, Y, and Z, that you're clearly not really a real Christian. And, and 4 different people would say, it's obvious that this is wrong or that you're wrong. And I'm like, well, guys, all 4 of you are saying things are obvious, and you're saying different answers. So you're like, you can't all obviously be right.
Yeah. Somebody is obviously wrong.
Yeah. So that kind of just put a dent and really subverted a lot of alleviated a lot of the intimidation, because I'm kind of like, well, look, I'm not saying that everything you believe is wrong. I can definitely learn from you in some way, but on this subject, you can't even agree on anything. And it was just sort of this just never-ending pendulum of, like, yes, you're saved by grace, but also this is works, and if you're not doing this, you should question your salvation. And then you do works, and that makes you confident in your salvation. But then they'll go preach and say, well, it's not by works that you're saved. And then there's a whole bunch of other pendulums. I'm just like, and eventually I just was like, enough. I'm tired of this. You keep saying that this is a free gift. You keep claiming that this is the thing that makes Christianity different in so many ways. And I'm just like, well, do you believe that or not? And after that, I did a lot more research. I did a lot of different, I listened to different points of view, but I did my own study of different things. And there's a lot of, in fact, I even have, in addition to the 2-hour live stream, I have another hour-long video in which on my own channel, which is kind of the, again, some other conclusions that are just like that. So that was really the 2-pronged aspect. That was one of the prongs that was kind of after I, really was discovering, like, that I was really solid on the fact that, okay, at least Christianity in specifically, even in, like, the core, like, the story of Jesus, is true. And that's a whole other bunch of research, which is kind of the second prong. But if you, if you want to ask any questions, go ahead. Sorry, but
no,
if I ever talk long, just let me know, because I can definitely go off on rabbit trails.
No, that's what I get for always my whole life being the long talker. So it's the least I can do is sit and listen to somebody else. So has there ever been a moment where you have doubted your faith, where you've been like, I don't think that this is true, or I don't know that this is true, and it took, like, real research and convincing for you to come back? Or have you always been pretty solid in your beliefs?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely had many periods of doubt. In fact, actually, I'll kind of work my answer into, because I know Tim asked the question, what does Eric's religion provide that atheism cannot? I would say, again, that's the first thing I would say is I believe this because I think it's true. But again, and I'll tell more of the story now as to kind of a long process, because it kind of started when I was 13 and everything. It might have been 12 actually, or something like that, some age around that time period. But basically, and just for background, my parents were divorced when I was 6 years old. And
oh, wow.
My father was actually and still is an agnostic atheist. And my mother is a Christian. Now, while she was my primary caregiver, and technically I was primarily raised in a Christian home, I wasn't really absent of the fact that there are people who believe differently than I am, than I do. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I'm just listening.
Okay, yeah. So I would say, honestly, that a lot of the thing was it was kind of a big moment that really, for the first time, I really started to consider, maybe this isn't true. Is actually, actually after I started to talk to my dad, and then after I talked to specific, and after, I think I was actually, ironically, I think I was on some internet forum where, we were actually talking about movies and TV and anime, and actually there was actually this section about God, and I just was, as a teenager, I was just like, oh, I'll put my thing in, and I was like steamrolled by a lot of objections, and I was just like, oh,
from Christians or from atheists?
No, from atheists, and not even from Christians, and frankly, even the people who I kind of agreed with ultimately, I ultimately had to admit that I just didn't have answers to why I believe this. And at the end of the day, there was a bit of a thing where I was like, I admit I kind of want this to be true, but is it true?
Mm-hmm.
And I was just, and eventually, and this was kind of the first chapter in my life where I was kind of thinking, okay, I kind of have to do some, I don't really know even where to start with this respect. And a man who was actually my mother's boyfriend at the time, he gave me various books that were from Christians and Christian apologists and things like that. And as a teenager, I of course ate it up and basically almost believed everything implicitly. And I didn't end there, but that was where I ended up for a while. So essentially, I was convinced enough by a lot of different books that, okay, you know what, I can believe that, the Christian faith is true, specifically, broadly speaking, because, again, I didn't think, the apostles had reasons to lie. And, I was like, they basically went to grizzly death, proclaiming that and that sort of thing. And the other thing is the dating, and I know we kind of skipped over where I go with the dating, but I kind of, it was a lot of different things with that kind of convinced me at first, but at the end of the day, it wasn't the last time that I would have some doubts about my faith. But I don't know if you want to ask any questions.
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like the idea of belief in itself, just the very basic idea of belief as a word, requires doubt in order to be considered belief. You know what I mean? Like, if you've never once doubted yourself and you've never once given yourself the opportunity to look at the opposite side, would what you believe truly be belief? I don't think so. But if you've questioned yourself and you've doubted yourself and you've done the research that you feel like you need to do in order to truly believe what it is you say you believe, I think that's real belief.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way of putting it. But yeah, no, I do think, and at the very least, I do think belief is more meaningful when you've actually questioned it and come to it. So basically, for a while, I kind of just, I ate it up. I swallowed everything that the book said, hook, line, and sinker, at the time. But, and for a while, I was kind of able to, funnily enough, I was kind of able to, at least thwart off arguments from other teenagers because I went from to a public school. But I was kind of like, all right, you know what? I admit I know why. I kind of know that there are people who believe it. I don't think that they're stupid. I just think that they may not know different things. So different things that I do. So what I would say that the next kind of process in the picture was really my belief in miracles at this point, which is the supernatural, And by miracles, I don't mean the fact that miracles are even possible, but the fact that, that there are, that is that even a feasible thing in the life of a believer? And I was kind of like, because I kept reading the Bible, and I was just like, well, they say all these things, like these wonderful things that are just, like if you have faith as, as small as a mustard seed, you can throw mountains of the sea. And I'm like, I just flat out don't believe that, if I was honest with myself. Because but I mean, nobody, like, even my pastors and different people who answered my questions didn't really have that much of like answers that really satisfied me. I kind of felt as though they just were, giving me the runaround for a while. So that kind of set me on a bit of an embarkment on really exploring the idea. And the funny thing is that that miracles, because I was actually dating this girl in high school, and I had actually thought that, first of all, that God had told me that we would get married one day, and that was, and I believed this with all of my heart and everything else, and it was in retrospect, dumb teenage love, but
Tim, we found our innocent teenager. We found him. He's right here.
Oh yeah, definitely. But yeah, no. And there was even a point where I thought, in my mind that God, that God is definitely going to bring her, like, because she suffered from clinical depression, and I had literally no idea how to even approach something like that.
Right.
And I was just at the time. And she was just not interested for a while. And at the end of the day, I got so fed up that I kind of thought that God told me that, she's going to come back on March 21st. And that didn't happen, needless to say. And I was basically like, because I'd always been told, you have a relationship with God. And I'm like, well, okay, but I mean, if I can't even talk to him, what kind of relationship is that? And, I'm kind of like, and it was a bit of a crisis, but it did want me to explore the topic a bit more. And I had no idea about, any of the other miracle stuff, but both good and bad. Like I was, in one way, I was spared from like, televangelist, scam artists, but I wasn't also aware of, the fact that there were people, some even in the U.S., though it's not as common, but, throughout the world that did believe other things. But that kind of led me to the point where I was obsessed with, getting certainty about what I thought. And I got involved when I went to college, because, I was very much involved in I got involved in a very horrible, like, judgmental church, because the churches I grew up in weren't really, like, they didn't fit, like, the typical stereotypes of, like, I didn't have to deal with, the weird lectures and kind of just the really awkward, like, the awkward sex talks. I mean, they talked about it and different things, but it was more, it was far less than just, a lot of, the typical narratives in terms of, like, a lot of what people believe, or people have gone through. But I would say that, I basically made up for, sadly, during my college years, in my freshman and sophomore year, I was more so like, okay, I got involved with, a really strict, very highly judgmental group. And, after I finally fell away from them, because they were, my dad actually, interestingly enough, when I finally was just so tired of them, because, it was almost just killing me to almost be in that sort of an environment where,
definitely.
I was just like, I physically hate this. I just flat out, I'm just like, I just hate doing this. It killed me. And and I even talked to my dad about it because, and he admittedly was even to the point where he even thought that I was like to the point where, is this really what Christianity teaches? And he's like, and I even had to grapple with it, but my dad actually uncovered a few kind of sketchy things on their website, because the funny thing is that this group had like an organic farm, and they were like ridiculously overpricing things, and it was kind of just, it kind of exposed them to me as like, well, look, my entire reason for following you is because you claim to have like spiritual gifts and everything, and at the end of the day, I'm like, well, look, if I can't trust you about things that I can verify, I'm certainly not trusting you with anything related to God. And
yeah, no, that's a good point.
and I was like, and after that, I sadly, I was even, judgmental to my poor mother. But yeah, but after that, I was just so almost distressed about the situation, to the point where I'm just like, I don't even know where I'd go from here, because while those people were definitely frauds, a lot of the texts that they tried to say to convince me to be more strict was definitely, just checking the phone, the battery on my phone, but
oh no, yeah,
but yeah, essentially I was just really in a bad place, and I wasn't sure of, am I even saved? And I did go back to questioning, first of all, Christianity to an extent, and I did actually, and this is when I kind of, after a while, I started to listen to debates, online about, various, Christian opponents. There were even a few, like, different people, like the Four Horsemen were kind of big when I was in college, and
yeah,
they still are, but at the same time, I feel as though on the internet they're a bit less present than they used to be. But at the time, I was kind of like, well, there are a lot of people out there, and there were even a lot of atheists who watched debates where there was where they said a lot of the things that I believed, but the atheist side was just simply not convinced by it, and there was a bit of trepidation at my point, because I'm kind of like, well, like, I was almost just like, well, wait, why aren't you converting? And just
it's okay. Hey, why haven't you converted yet? I don't understand.
Yeah, and just like, and that sort of thing. So I was kind of just at the same time, I was like, could they actually have answers that like I don't think about in that point? And I was, and I have to admit, and for a while, there were a lot of objections that they sort of countered a lot of the things with a lot of claims of different arguments, a lot of different things about certain sources that were said to be corroborative of the Bible. They tried to dispute it, and various things like that. And I had to admit ultimately that at the end of the day, after a while, and by the time I was in like this is kind of my senior year of college, I had to admit that at the end of the day, I was kind of just giving the benefit of the doubt to the Christian speakers, more so than like the atheists. And I was kind of like, do I even do this? And my a few professors that I had, and I still love the man to this day. Dr. Darko, actually, who was he taught a lot of things about history and the biblical worldview, and he was even critical of a lot of different people on the evangelical side, and particularly Westerners, and because he's from Ghana, and he believed that there were certain lenses through which people were reading the Bible that just weren't good. And at the end of the day, I really started to say, and he really instilled in me the idea, and he had certain answers to my questions at the end of the day, but he didn't readily give them to me. He kind of just was like, well, look, if you're just going to ask me for questions like this, then, you know, you kind of, like, you're going to be just afraid of people who say something different at the end of the day. And he said, well, look, I have to start with whatever it is. Otherwise, I'm not like a real scholar, frankly. I have to start from from a point of view of evidence at that point. And, you know, whether you agree with his conclusions or not, that's still a good way, I think, to approach things. And it was kind of.
And was he, so he was, though, he was like an atheist? He wasn't.
No, actually, he was a Christian. Actually.
Oh, interesting. So okay.
Yeah, and he kind of did exemplify the idea of, like, you know, he wanted his students to learn how to think, not just what to think.
Right.
But he was very good at undercutting assumptions that, you know, everybody had and different things. And to the college's credit, and again, they didn't, like, pamper us, even though it was a Christian university. They even had us watch debates on the problem of evil and write an essay on it or something, like, you know, and there was even a debate where I had to admit that it was actually the problem of evil. And, you know, even though I agreed with the Christian speaker, it was with, like, Bart Ehrman. And I was like, well, I kind of have to admit Bart Ehrman won, or at least he was more convincing, and I would be more inclined to believe him if you know, I was
interesting,
more of an agnostic. And I had to admit ultimately that I was just, that I had to learn, first of all, the basics and things of, like, epistemology, how to think even so, and just to learn the processes a lot of the time for myself. And of course, because I actually suffer from clinical OCD, and, you know, I also, while it does also provide me with a lot of obsession, like, I can't ignore doubts, I also can't, I also really want things to be just right at the same time, and I'm not comfortable with a lot of uncertainties and different things like that, or at least I wasn't then. So,
you know, Eric, I have to say, this last, like, 20 minutes that you've been telling me your story, like, your personal story, this spells out your ideology so clearly and concisely. Like, I don't know how often you share your personal story like this, but that, like, just the crescendo that you've gone on, like, explaining the beginning, the middle, the end, like, questions that you had, journeys that you went through, the thought processes, that so clearly and concisely spells out for me your exact thought processes so clearly. Like, before, I understood that there was a process, and I was trying to get kind of to the bottom of how you do your research. But when you tell your story, it makes 1,000% like more sense, and it's a great story. Like, I really enjoyed hearing this because it's answered so many of the questions that I had, in terms of, like, you being upfront and honest about questioning your faith, and you going and, like, seeking out answers and finding, like, atheist debates, and kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Resigning yourself to the idea that you actually do agree with some of the atheists, and, like, approaching scholars about it, and your professors. This is a really cool story. And I think if you don't have this on your channel yet, maybe you do, you should totally tell this version of your story to more people, because it really, really highlights what I was trying to get to the bottom of through my questions earlier. And you're a great storyteller.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I can and definitely, yeah, I'll come to more of the story specifically. And actually, I don't have that on my channel. Actually, I've never really thought of telling my specific testimony. But
yeah.
But I mean, if it's an endorsement from you, I mean, if that's not a good indication I should do it, then I mean, I don't know what is. So
yeah, because I
I
really think people would relate a lot to what you're talking about, in terms of, like, not knowing what to believe, not knowing what's real, like, hearing different versions of like, Christian-sided arguments, and you're not even sure which one of those are true. Like, they can't even agree. And then hearing atheist arguments where you're like, oh, that makes sense. Like, now I'm sweating it because, like, does that make me an atheist? It's very interesting to hear this, like, this kind of cognitive journey that you went on. And I think a lot of people, both people who are still Christian and people who decided at the end to be atheist, I think the entire gamut of types of people would relate a lot to your experiences and your story.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And, but anyway, like in a good story, I guess I'll get to where I'm at now and everything else.
Sure.
So, so basically, essentially, I had to really go back to the basics. And essentially, I was like, okay, how do I know? Like for example, there were various claims of various different Christian apologists. Like we'll go actually with the dating of like the Gospels. And I had to go with and just basically say, okay, so basically the atheist objections tend to be, well, the Gospels are just too late to be reliable. Essentially, like they were written decades afterwards. And while I did admit that was good, I felt as though there was a lot of different answers originally, but I still needed to question them because, again, I was starting from scratch. And basically, I did conclude after a while that I do believe that the Gospels were, first of all, written earlier, because I found out like that a lot of the reason why maybe, and by the way, do you just tell me if you want to hear actually the specific reasons or anything else, or whether or not.
Yeah, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I did come to the conclusion that, like, okay, I can kind of see where atheists are coming from, because they say, okay, the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem happened in 70 AD. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, talk about that. So it had to have happened after 70 AD. The thing is that, with regards to the dating specifically, I was like, but I had heard a lot of different things about how, first of all, there were a lot of political tensions. So even like, because while it is in the context of Jesus doing a prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem, it is still not hard to guess. So it wasn't as hard to guess as before. Additionally, the Old Testament, there is a few books. There is actually some stuff in the Old Testament that, in like Daniel, and whether or not you even can verify the other stuff in the book, it did talk about that, and there are manuscripts that kind of predate that, but it's not necessarily. I mean, it's still not a miracle that I would even use as like proof that Jesus is God, because there actually are some, like, it was kind of both sides where I'm kind of like, well, I don't agree with the atheist here, but I also won't use it as a miracle story. So in that way, and there were other arguments that convinced me that the Gospels were written a bit earlier, but still much later than would typically be expected. But I also went into different people who would contest various things about the reliability of like oral traditions and people's memories and back then, because
right.
And I want to be, and I just want to be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not saying that like human beings in one time period have an inherently better memory than others. It's just that they tend to exercise it more. And since you're exercising your memory, it does tend to be a little bit better, within certain limits, obviously, but it's still kind of, it does have an impact on that. But also the fact that the writing was just so expensive and laborious and time consuming that, it wasn't like they just picked it up 15 years later and just did something. And then, so it more alleviated my fears that they couldn't possibly be reliable. But at the same time, I still had to admit that, okay, they're written within the same time period, but I'm like, at the same time, I had to admit that there were other religious texts that I had to look at, and there were even other modern miracle claims that many other people were like, well, okay, but do you believe that? Do you believe this? And I was like, and I had no idea what to say to those things. And, you know, I could give the standard answer of, well, the non-Christian religions are, you know, like worshiping, you know, a different God, or they're secretly worshiping, you know, demons who are trying to trick them. And while ultimately that may not be a wrong conclusion, it still needed to just be more substantiated than just basically saying, well, I'm just going to believe Christianity because it's what I always believed.
Do you think that any part of the Bible could be, you know, the game of telephone, how by the time the message gets to the end of the room, it's like a totally different message. Do you think that any part of the Bible at all could have been a victim of the same thing, where like people telling a story and retelling a story so many times that maybe it's like an exaggerated version or anything like that? Or do you think it's all pretty accurate and true?
Well, it actually depends more on what specific parts of the Bible you're talking about, which have a greater chance of that. And while I'm ultimately still, you know, a believer, I still have to admit that there are more areas of the Bible that may be more subjected to that, like, you know, different Old Testament texts, because, you know, a lot of that was written, you know, a lot of the time before, you know, writing was even standard. And so it's possible, but again, just from a purely objective standpoint, to come to that conclusion, what I would say, I don't think it's as likely, at least not in terms of like specifically the stories of Jesus, because like the game of telephone it has a lot of rules in it that don't really apply to real life. For example, with regards to Matthew and John, like you don't have to like just tell somebody that. It's kind of just it's kind of a first person thing. But even in the idea of like, you know, set the people who just interviewed others like Luke, I was more it's kind of like you can also, first of all, you can write things down and you can also have them repeated, whereas, you know, neither of those things are really allowed in telephone, at least as far as I'm aware. So ultimately...
Well, for example, in the book of Genesis, I believe, they talk about the Nephilim, which are a human, and I'm explaining this to the audience in case you think I'm like, I don't think you know the Bible.
No,
yeah,
okay. I know what you're talking
yeah,
about.
yeah. And so for anybody watching who might not be familiar, the Nephilim are a combination of angels and human beings. And basically the story is that God told angels, don't have sex with earthly women when you go down there. And they did, and the product of their sin was the Nephilim. And they're these kind of magical, I guess is the best word I can come up with, but nefarious individuals. They're not good. They kind of ruin wherever they go. They're very much like giants. And so when the Bible talks about stuff like that, do you think that that's more of like hyperbole to tell a story, or do you think that whoever wrote that actually believed that? Do you believe that? What are your thoughts on parts like that?
That specifically, I really don't know about. I haven't had the opportunity to really look into that. I mean, I'm kind of open to, you know, different things and different interpretations and different things like that. But at the same time, I'm kind of like I just don't know, honestly, with regards to that specific question. But I mean, to answer the more bigger point of like whether it's possible for some things to be hyperbolized, I mean, sure, it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm not saying that like from a purely historical perspective, of course, it's possible that they can. Now, of course, this is also establishing just the fact that we can't, that, you know, just because you can do something doesn't mean they did it. And that's another question. And while there's, again, the thing about like oral cultures is, again, that there's a bit more difficulty, is it's really a case by case scenario. Because there are some people in some cultures that are more where people can just memorize a lot easier, a lot of different things. But in other cultures, it's just like so much. It's kind of just uncontrolled and but more like, admittedly, the game of specifically telephone in that way. But I guess what really can kind of at least made me lean more in the direction of that. Okay, it's more reliable, and for the record, also, it doesn't necessitate the fact that Jesus is because it's entirely possible that there are certain quote things about Jesus saying things that are paraphrases or at least something, because it was more important to get the gist of things in those days at the same time, although there was a lot more precision in certain instances. So, but ultimately in the research that I did with certain Josephus and different things like that, I would say that because of the fact that, there were many people who even memorized huge amounts of the Old Testament or sometimes even the whole thing, and that they were there, plus the fact that the rabbis would sort of just repeat things over and over and over and over again, as well as, having spent the time living it, I do think it's more, they certainly, I think, would have had the capacity to do it. So that kind of answered the capacity question, as opposed to now the real sticky part, of course, is, whether or not they actually did, whether or not they were motivated by certain things and certain other factors. And ultimately, just to sum up very, very briefly, I would say that, first of all, the fact that they would even write documents when typically in the ancient world, given the fact that, literacy rates weren't all that high, and, typically the least educated people are the people who kind of a lot of con artists tend to target, it wouldn't have really been lucrative for them if they weren't at least sincere in their beliefs or sincere in their attempts to, this wasn't like a get-rich-quick scheme, at least not as far as I could tell. And after that happened, and then, of course, there's various things about sincerely, maybe they were just sincerely deceived or different things like that, which is another possibility that, again, like there could be some element that may explain some things, but it doesn't explain at least not all of the facts to me. And plus, there really isn't as much motivation because first of all, to preach a crucified person in the ancient world was just so really, really unusual. So, in that way, it's a little bit, and I do think that I will admit, though, that some of the sources that I used to sort of corroborate the Bible didn't hold up, at least not as far, or at least I wouldn't use them anymore. But, I think some, like, for example, Tacitus, as well as some of the Talmudic things and that are written about Jesus, and it's some of them. So it is a very long and arduous discussion where you basically have to go into, well, yes, like this person is a New Testament scholar, but like it kind of requires a lot more study of like, the Talmud to see whether that's accurate, or and even like people who specifically study Tacitus and different things like that. Long story short, ultimately I did come to the belief that that while admittedly I did admit that there was I did understand the hiccups that people were having, and I definitely sort of empathized with that kind of an aspect. I ultimately did conclude that I'm more willing to accept. I'm at least willing to accept that, but of course there were other things like what religion, whether what religion is true. And by the way, I kind of did a lot of this all at once, not necessarily in order. So it may be a bit of like Quentin Tarantino style storytelling, but this is sort of the latter half. So
yeah, you said a lot fewer F-bombs than Quentin Tarantino would have, but otherwise pretty similar.
Yeah.
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 Well,
But okay, go ahead.
yeah, well, I know that I told you I would only keep you for 2 hours, and we're coming up to the top of that second hour, but,
Oh,
I wanted to find out from you, if there was a message or a lesson, or if you were to say, "People listening, if you take nothing else away from what I'm saying, please take this." What would that be? What would you say?
oh, absolutely. I'm glad you did it because I'll actually skip more to the end of my story here because after I looked into miracles and there definitely were a lot of sketchy people involved in that, and there was a lot of other religions that did. And I will admit that if I had to sum up my entire thing, I would say that ultimately there isn't any reason to fear specifically analysis and even deep analysis. Um, and to me, I realize that there's a lot of, it's certainly not easy. It's very time consuming and different things like that. But if I had to say one thing, I would say that as a person who's actually struggled with OCD and even clinical anxiety and just basically ranted at God and done so many things and just that, I will admit ultimately that I still, at the end of the day, do have a relationship with God. And I'm not afraid anymore of being uncertain or not having the answers to everything. And that's okay. And I guess I will say that even if an unbeliever does come and hear every single nuance of what I say and still does, believe differently than me, then okay, I don't think you're stupid. I don't think I'm certainly never going to condescend to somebody because this is kind of a very hard topic to research and
Totally.
in a lot of ways. So I guess at the end of the day, the biggest takeaway is actually just my lack of fear in different things. And I had some rather good experiences that maybe I can tell you about another time. But ultimately, I had to say that I've come to a point, and actually, maybe I'll even say this about in when I do tell my testimony on my channel. So
Yeah, you should.
you want to come?
You really should.
So I guess that's my shameless plug to see the rest of it on my channel.
Yeah.
So if you want to know actually everything that went on, I'll do another video. So, but for now, just don't give in to fear, I guess.
I love that. Don't give in to fear. Research, question everything, come to the conclusion you need to come to based on the research that you do, don't just blindly follow anyone either. I feel like is like part of that.
Definitely.
Well,
So,
Eric,
but anyway, but thanks so much, Sydney.
Yeah.
I really had a great time here. Again, I still appreciate everything, and hey, it worked out. So
yeah.
And by the way, and thank you also to Brian, because wasn't he the one who suggested the call in?
I was gonna say Brian saved the show. Brian saved the day, man.
Thank you. So awesome.
Yeah.
We're I'm in your debt. So
yeah.
But in any case, Sydney, hey, if you want to hear more about it, I'll definitely we'll keep in touch. So
yeah, definitely, Eric. Thanks so much for being on the channel. I've really appreciated your honesty, and I know other people have in the chat too. One, because they literally said it, and two, because I know these people show up to a lot of shows, and they really appreciate the honesty. And I also appreciate your candid nature, and that, like you said, you don't have fear. So I didn't at any point feel like you were like afraid to answer questions or afraid to be as honest as possible. And you weren't afraid to tell what you actually believe, and I think it's great. I think that's really cool, and I truly think that if you tell your story on your channel, whether it's in one video, whether maybe it's a series, however you feel like best suits your channel, I think a lot of people would really relate to that and relate to the feelings and the experiences that you describe. And I think a lot of people would find peace in that too, and realizing that they're not the only ones. I think a lot of people, when they start to doubt their faith, they think they're the only ones doing it, and they freak out because they think everybody else is completely solid in their beliefs around them. But for you, who's somebody who is devout and has like a channel based on your faith and your religion, comes out and says, yeah, I've questioned it too. I've even thought that a couple of atheists were making pretty good points in the past too. I think that's important and that people need to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sydney.
No problem.
But hey, and hey, if you ever want another interview again,
Yeah.
this is a preconceived yes. So, and we'll make it happen one way or another.
Perfect. And thanks to everybody in the chat. And we are going to say